So my name's Joanne Richards, and I'm the president of Common Ground for Texans, and I'd like to welcome you all today for a wonderful program. I usually introduce this by saying what comes next, and May 15th is our next meeting, again from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, and I hope that we will have some journalists and community activists on the program to talk about the results of the May 1st election, what the consequences are for us for those propositions that have passed and maybe for those that have failed. And by that time, we should also have a pretty good idea of what's going to come out of the legislative session. So it won't be over, but essentially it will be over. So we can have a animated discussion about what happened. So today, one of the things that we're going to do is to show a number of video clips. And as before we show the first one, I will introduce those video clips to you so that you have an idea of where they're coming from. But I'll turn the program over to our moderator right now, and that is Mike Ignatowski.
Hey, Joanne, thanks again, as usual. And welcome everyone to our program today. Having a well-functioning news media and now social media is central to having a well-functioning democracy. And the questions around media accuracy and bias and fake news and social media benefits and polarization and manipulation reached quite a crescendo leading up to the last election. And this is something that's not going to go away. It's going to be an ongoing issue in America for quite a while. So I'm thrilled that we have two excellent speakers here to talk about that today. Tom Mast is the leader of the Braver Angels Central Texas Media Action Group, and Talia Stroud, who is the director of the Center for Media Engagement, Moody College of Communication in UT Austin. They're both doing a lot of really excellent work in this area, engaging a lot of people. And we'll let them talk a little bit about that as we get going here. Our format will be a slight variation in what we normally do. We'll have a discussion. I'll ask our panelists some questions, engage in conversation, and we'll break that up with some short film clips about news media. Altogether, we will have about 40 minutes of this, and then we'll go over to audience question and answer. And as usual, you can type your questions in at any time during the program into the chat window, and they go directly to Ham Richards, then Ham Richards will select and read them during the Q&A session. And then we'll let that go for a while, and at some point after the hour, try not to drag it on too long. Even though this is quite an interesting topic, we might get quite a few questions here. So let's start off the discussion, and I'll turn to Tom Mast first. Can you give us some background information on the Media Action Group you got started, how it plays into Braver Angels, and maybe a little information about how people can get involved if they want to?
Well, sure, Mike, I appreciate that. Braver Angels is a national organization, and it has roughly 50 alliances, which is what they're called. They might be called chapters in some other group, but they're scattered all across the country. And it's grown like a weed, particularly this last year. And I'm not sure what the explanation for that is, but it has. It's not an old organization. It's just several years old, 4 or 5, something like that. It has around 50 alliances. Braver Angels Central Texas is headquartered here in Austin, and often goes by BACT, Braver Angels Central Texas. And it's often regarded as the strongest of Braver Angels alliance in the country. And it has been a very strong one and continues to be. It offers workshops, debates, and other types of events to learn civil discourse. And you read basically the same words when you read about Common Ground for Texans. So the goals of the two organizations are very similar. Braver Angels Central Texas has a website at braverangelcentraltexas.org, in case you're interested in learning more about it. And there's actually a tab on there for the Media Action Group. And the Braver Angels Central Texas Alliance sponsors the Media Action Group. Now, let me start by saying, in talking about the Media Action Group, what our objective is. It's to stimulate an improvement in the reporting of serious news and opinion in our country. And those words were carefully chosen. It's been active since last summer. And you ask how we got started. Well, I met with Steve Saltwick, who at that time was one of the co-leaders of the Alliance, and now he's moved somewhat more onto the national scene, but he's one of the two advisors for our Media Action Group. And we got to talking about what I would like to do, and I was enjoying doing the things that Media Action Group, that Braver Angel Central Texas does, holds workshops and teaches people how to have civil discourse and be polite and don't step on people's toes and search for common ground and all those sorts of things, which are very important. But I expressed an interest in doing something that might have more effect on the country, and we almost immediately started talking about the media as being something that disturbs nearly everyone these days. And so we started the Media Action Group shortly thereafter. And it grew out of at that time, a months-old effort by Braver Angels to have more of a policy effect in the country. Now, we're a little bit different from Common Ground in that we don't Braver Angels typically doesn't take strong positions on legislation or particular legislators and that sort of thing. We're pretty sensitive about that, but that doesn't mean we can't be for things like reducing polarization and so forth. So that's what this is all about. And so this fit under the term of action groups, and there had been 2 or 3 attempts to have action groups previously, and they had all died. And so this one has out-survived the predecessors by 6 months or so. So we're happy to have that accomplishment behind us. We have so far held 9 significant Zoom events over the past several months. And then we, in February, formed smaller teams to begin taking some action. The Zoom events prior to that were primarily a learning exercise. And we had basically started from scratch and understanding the media and what drives it. And so now the idea is to communicate to as many people as possible that we citizens can do something about the media. So we have to figure out what that is, and we think we know, and then we have to go do it. And that's a longer term program. And one of the reasons the action groups have a hard time continuing is that they're not one-off events. They don't have a Zoom event like a workshop and then go off and do something else. They're designed to last indefinitely and have an effect. Let me just, we have 2 questions on our minds right now. Is it better to approach the media directly and ask them to do a better job, or to alert consumers of the media that they can reject inaccurate and/or biased news and switch to something better? And I tend to think the second one is probably more practical. The media organizations that are doing the wrong thing are generally doing it for a reason, and quite often that reason is money. And so it's difficult for them to make a change without having a really good reason to do it, like losing customers. Anyhow, let me say that this is a very rewarding and important undertaking, that grassroots make a lot of sense for it, and that it fits Braver Angels' mission of reducing polarization, which is a primary cause of the dysfunction in our country. So that's a little background on Braver Angels and Braver Angels in Central Texas and on our Media Action Group. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to say so. You can go to our website, braverangelcentraltexas.org, and learn more about it. We would be, of course, delighted to have you join if you can scrape up $12 a year to pay the dues. So please do. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks, Tom. And if they want to join the action group specifically, what should they do?
You can contact me and I will put my name and address into chat. Is that available right now, Ham? Okay.
It is.
It is available.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So while Tom is doing that, let's turn to our second speaker, Talia Stroud. Talia is the director of the Center for Media Engagement at UT. They're doing a lot of fascinating work there. I was looking over the website recently, some great initiatives, things that I'd love to learn more about. So Talia, can you tell us about how this got started and what your main goals are there?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the Center for Media Engagement was formally started in 2017, although we'd been doing some related work since 2011. And the mission is, how can we improve what the media is doing within a democracy? And there's a lot to be done, as you might imagine, stemming from that mission. We're centered around 4 key pillars. The first is understanding what's happening with news and social media. The second is looking at propaganda. The third, media ethics. And the fourth, science communication. And I'll offer just a little bit of a description of what we're doing in each of those areas. So with news and social media, we've actually been partnering with news organizations. To date, we've partnered with over 150 news organizations across the United States to do research on what works and what doesn't to help meet their democratic obligations and commitments. And then we're also collaborating with a number of social media companies to try to understand what effect they're having on the public and how they could do that better. The propaganda vertical has really been focused on understanding newer ways in which those who have an intent to disinform have been doing their work. So an example of that would be examining nano influencers, which is, instead of having bots that are now growing increasingly possible to detect, foreign agents and even domestic in some cases are hiring people who have large followings or creating people that get large followings, but they're actual people and they're being paid to share disinformation. And so the group has been tracking some of that. The third is our media ethics vertical, and the media ethics group, it's a wonderful program where undergraduate students are paired with graduate students and faculty members. And they try to unpack what some of the ethical dilemmas are facing media organizations these days. So for instance, if you're a social media company, should you remove content that may be offensive to some people or not remove it? And it turns out that's actually a very challenging ethical question, and it's not clear cut what should be done. And so through these exercises, what happens is the students collaborate to write different perspectives on the issue and provide an ethical justification for different ways of looking at it. And then it's shared in the form of a case study that's now been used at a number of different universities across the United States. So the students not only get the experience of becoming an author, but then they also have their work shared, and it helps to inform other students across the country. And then finally, our science communication vertical is really focused on working with scientists because oftentimes they're receiving no training before they're put in front of the media or before they're asked to comment on things. And it turns out that that's not really a skill set that many scientists have. And so the science communication vertical is really trying to figure out how can we help scientists perform this role better, especially in a time when we so need to hear from scientists and have their expertise infused in the media. So those are the key pillars or the key verticals across the center. I'd say that the thing that makes our center different from others is, first, we are really dedicated to partnership. So we're always partnering with other organizations and media outlets. The The second is we're very practical. So we are not, nothing against those organizations that are very theoretical and in the academy coming up with kind of heady academic ideas. We're very much like what's practical and can be put into place as soon as possible. And then finally, we're very solutions oriented. So what is it that we can do to help to improve what's happening right now? So that's the Center for Media Engagement. And thank you just so much for hosting this conversation. I've had such pleasure in looking over what initiatives you all are doing, and Tom, what your organization is doing. I think this is so important, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this.
Great, thanks, Talia. You can find your website just by doing a search on Center for Media Engagement. I did that earlier, just a ton of great information. I'm thrilled with the amount of work that's being done there. A lot of important topics. So with that introduction behind us, I want to turn this over to Joanne Richards to introduce the first video clip we're going to watch together.
Okay, and I thought I would share some really interesting information from, I'm a graduate from Iowa State, and several years ago, and this addresses one of Talia's comments, several years ago, the Iowa State decided to take all of its science faculty and put them on a bus. And they took them from city to city in Iowa to talk to regular everyday citizens about what the scientists do. Because in fact, that communication just wasn't taking place, which is absolutely fascinating to me. Well, and now you also know why I asked Tom and Talia both together to come and talk to us, because they're looking at similar subjects from very different perspectives, but equally important ones. So what I wanted to do was, it was interesting that my son graduated from Hampshire College. They are having in the middle of their 50th anniversary, and they had a program called Media, Power, and Justice. And there were two journalists who were speaking to each other that had both graduated from Hampshire actually, Hampshire's odd. You're given your date of the date that you entered Hampshire rather than the date that you graduate, because you never know when you will graduate, but you always know when you got there. And so they were all part of the class that entered in the fall of '92. Jennifer Pozner is the first one, and Fariba Nawa. And it's to some extent unfortunate that Jennifer is the one who speaks more about the topic that we're talking about. Fariba talks more about international journalism, but I thought for our conversation, Jennifer's comments were particularly telling. The first series of short clips is about media integrity, and I thought that would be a good way to start. And so Ham Richards has to share his screen so that we can get them started.
So media literacy is basically a system of, it's a way to bring critical thinking to everything that we engage with in media, and to define media in a broad way. Media is not just, media is not singular, right? I always talk about media are, right? So media are newspapers and magazines and TV and radio, but they're also podcasts, and they're also independent zines, and they're also marketing copy on cereal boxes in the supermarket. And they're also billboards on the side of the road. Media is anything with words and text and images that give off a message, right? And so media literacy offers tools and sort of a framework through which you can deconstruct those messages. You can be more critical and aware of what you're taking in. So for example, when you're trying to figure out why. Have you ever? I'm sure you have. Even just personally, but especially as a mom with kids, right? Have you ever watched a TV show or a movie with your daughters and you're like, something doesn't feel right about this?
Like most of the things I watch.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of us like can look at that and be very clear about what we feel is, what's wrong with a particular thing that we're watching in pop culture. It might be a little harder to know exactly what it is that we feel is off about a piece of news. It might also be difficult to figure out what makes us uncomfortable about a movie or a song or a video, right? If we bring a critical media literacy lens to those pieces of media that we're taking in, if we ask ourselves things like, who created this message? Who is this message aimed at? Who do we assume the target audience for this message is? Do we have a sense of the race or the gender or the class background of the target audience? Does that target audience, in the minds of the media outlets that have created this image or this message, does that target audience change the content and the way the content is constructed? Do we have a sense of how? If it's news, do we get a sense that there are more than one kind of source? Are there more than one kind of source being addressed in the story? If it's a story about economics, are you only hearing from people from Wall Street? Are you only hearing from the Fed? Are you also hearing from people who have a variety of academic or economic justice backgrounds? Is that if we can condition ourselves to think about what is the text versus what is the subtext, if we can think about who are the messages created for, how would the messages shift if a more diverse set of people or populations were used as sources in news for this story or as the cast members of a particular show? Who is creating the message? That's another thing to think about with media literacy. Is the writer's room of your TV show staffed mostly by white men? Are there women of color in the writer's room? Are there young people in the writer's room? If a movie is has a plot about autism, are there any autistic people in the creation of the show? Or is it just people who don't have any expertise with autism deciding they're going to make a show about autism or a movie about, So these are the kinds of questions. There's so many, but these are just sort of the beginnings of ways that you can bring critical thinking to the engagement level of media. And the last thing I'll say about that is just that a good rule to keep in your mind is there's no such thing as mindless entertainment. We all, and there's never a good time to, quote, turn your brain off when you're watching media. It doesn't mean you can't have fun with it. And it doesn't mean you can't use media to enjoy yourself and relax. I do all the time. I'm not just a media critic, I'm a media fan. I will admit that. But we have to keep our brains on. We have to keep that critical filter on, because when it's off, that's when we're subject to disinformation, to biased messages, narratives, subtext, etc. Main thing also is to have these very key questions in mind. Who created the message? What's the text? What's the subtext? How would it be different if there are different people involved? Who owns it? Who's profiting from it? Etc.
Thanks. I love that last comment about mindless entertainment, because when you turn your mind off, that lets things come in unfiltered by any skepticism check. So Tom and Talia, let's talk about standards for journalism, what you see as the main problems, what do you expect them to adhere to? And feel free to also comment about who this should apply to, because at one time it was very clear who journalists are and are not, and that line's getting very blurred nowadays. So we'll let Tom go first and then Talia after that.
Well, let me begin by saying I'm not an academic, so what I've learned about this subject, I learned in the last 6 months for the most part. And I read a wonderful book, which is this, The Elements of Journalism by Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenthal. So just Google The Elements of Journalism, what news people should know and what the public should expect. And for $5 if you want a used one, or $10 if you want a new one, you can get one. And it is a wonderful, wonderful book by two highly distinguished journalists. So I sorted all of this out of the book, and I have about 7 items that they stressed in the book. The first being the primary purpose of journalism is to provide the public with the information they need to be free and self-governing. And I really, really believe that. And along with that, you often hear, and also to provide them with the information they need to lead their own lives well. So that's one of the 7 that I picked out of the book. And another is the foundation of journalism is verification. And we're seeing all too little of that these days. And let me say that I don't think the elements of journalism, the foundation, have changed one iota. Now, does anybody, do any organizations or any journalist absolutely 100% live up to these? Maybe. If so, it's rare. But there's no doubt that some do a whole lot better job than others, and some don't even try these days. So I don't think the standards of journalism have changed one iota. I think what media has decided to do to cope with its money problems and to cope with the polarization and to cope with the lightning speed of news these days, given the digital tools we have, organizations have decided to just ignore some of it. But I don't, the foundation, just like a religion, the rules don't change, the 10 commandments don't change. It's just that people decide that they're going to ignore some of them. Another couple out of the 7, and I won't read all of them. Journalism's first loyalty is to the public. Loyalty that requires vigilance. And another is journalists must maintain an independence from those they cover. So those are 4 of the 7. And I really commend this book to you. It's not particularly light reading, although it's not difficult, but it will take you a while. It's about 300 pages. So if you're seriously interested in this subject, that's a good place to start. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Tom. So Talia, you certainly do qualify as an academic here. Let's
I do,
talk
but
about
I had
standards.
I had such a smile because Tom's intuition of which book to go to is exactly the same as mine. So I will just give a tremendous +1 to that book. It really outlines, I think, beautifully what the responsibility is of journalists and what they should adhere to. And Tom did a great job of summarizing some of the components there. On the other part of your question, Mike, perhaps I can take that part on of thinking about where to draw the line. And it's just so difficult to do so these days to understand which organizations are trying to behave like journalists and present news and follow the tenets that come from the book from Rosenthal and Kovac, and which ones have other missions. And I have a couple of thoughts to share along those lines, and also I think a point of potential advocacy. The first is that some news organizations try to alert their readers, and I'm using the word readers actually purposefully here because it's frequently newspapers, as to whether the section of the newspaper is news or whether it's opinion. If you're online, they often try to show you that it's sponsored content, that some advertiser is in fact responsible for the content. And then sometimes they use the phrase news analysis. At the Center for Media Engagement, however, we did some analysis to find out what the effects of these labels are. And so we showed some people articles containing the labels, and others we showed the same articles without the labels. And the unfortunate finding from that study is that people by and large don't even notice these labels. It's become so much a part of the stuff you see at the top where it's a bunch of ads, it's a menu, it's so crowded and cluttered that these terms are not sticking out at all. We then did another study where we included these terms in the text of the article. So right beneath the headline, we said, like, this is an opinion article, and that means that this author is presenting a point of view. This is not necessarily news. It's not being endorsed by the journalists at this paper, as just an example. And there, people were actually able to find and identify and understand what the article really was. So I think that the point of advocacy here is when people are able to see these, when it's not crowded out by advertisements, when these labels are prominent on pages, they have a larger effect. And I think in so many parts of our media landscape, we're actually not given that information as consumers. So Fox News or MSNBC, for example, both of those cable news networks will say things like, we have some news programs and some commentary programs, but they're not very well labeled on their networks at all. In fact, you typically just hear their executives making those sorts of statements when they're talking about the channel overall. And so I think that there actually is work to be done to try to encourage news organizations to be better about labeling the content so that everyone is clear on what it is that they're getting from particular programs.
Great, thanks. So Joanne, let's go to the next news clip.
Yeah, so the next news clip is about framing the news or framing an article. And I thought it was particularly interesting from the point of view of having different lenses look at the same information, but come up with a different story.
Well, no, that's not the main chapter, but I don't remember what, oh no, sorry. The chapter is on framing, how news gets framed, how pop culture narratives get framed, and how those frames help us either see or put sort of blinders over our eyes that prevent us from seeing clearly what a community or an issue really is all about. And I opened that story, that chapter with a discussion of, or rather, I don't open it. The main deep dive in that framing chapter is a compare and contrast of the New York Times coverage of Michael Brown when he was murdered in Ferguson versus the profile of him versus the profile of him in this, I think it was the St. Louis Post-Gazette. I could be getting the outlet wrong. It's been many, many months since I wrote that chapter, but the titles, the headlines of those pieces, even just the headlines, you can understand the humanization versus the dehumanization in the frame. The headline in the New York Times was, Michael Brown was no angel. And the headline in the local newspaper was, Michael Brown was a gentle giant. And then the stories, as you might imagine, were built around even though the headlines, as you and I know as journalists, the headlines are not usually written by the people who write the stories.
Exactly.
And the headlines can often mislead what the story is actually about. But in those cases, the stories really, the headlines summed up the frames of the stories. The New York Times told stories from one story from one time in his school, he was accused of stealing something. And then his mom came in and showed the receipt, and it showed that he didn't steal the thing in the first place. No context, just he was accused of theft. And one after another pieces of information that could bias a reader toward thinking he deserved to be considered suspicious and then killed.
The way news sources frame something. Interesting clip. I'm going to ask both of our panel members if they have any comments on it. And now we'll reverse the order. Talia, you can get to go first, then Tom. Any thoughts that brings to mind on framing?
I mean, I think echoing back to the earlier clips, it just illustrates the importance of really being an active news consumer and thinking when you're getting information. But the truth of the matter is that everything is framed. It's not possible to write any article or put any piece of broadcast news out there that isn't framed, because it just simply isn't possible to say every aspect of every story from every angle. And so I think that that's a bit of a lesson as well, is there's no such thing as an unframed news story. And so we have to think about what is missing, what is included. Has the journalist done a good job of trying to cull this into the most important aspects of the story without leaving things out? But it's a challenging job.
Thanks, Tom. Any other comments?
Well, back to opinion versus news. I follow the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and they have 3 pages every day that have the word opinion on those last 3 pages in the first section. And they're huge letters, and they're really clear. And the first page is editorials, and the second 2 are opinions. And I've read, and we may get to this later, what opinion really is if it's well written. And opinion, if it's well written, can be extremely valuable. And I've gotten where I really learn from and enjoy the ones that I read in the Wall Street Journal. So, and they are framed well. And so they're biased. They present, the word opinion says they present a viewpoint, but they also present factual and truthful arguments for it, and give people some reason why the author feels the way he does. And so I found that to be very useful, but I agree that very much agree that that's the exception rather than the rule. And that opinion is so commonly mixed into the news, especially on television, but elsewhere too, that people can be forgiven for getting mixed up. I think it's a challenge to expect a person who's busy and has a job and a family and everything like that to be able to sort the truth from the fiction, or to sort the bias from the non-bias in watching TV or reading any article. The best thing to do is to develop a sense that you're being taken to the cleaners by whoever's presenting you this news, and you'll just dump it and go get something else. And there are some good ones out there. And I think that's the best approach to getting the media's attention. And that's what we would like to do. Thanks.
Thanks. The topic of online media came up a couple times. And this is a critical issue. If you ask people of my children's generation where they get most of their news, guess what they answer? It's from social media, which is a major topic of conversation. We all know that it has some benefits. It brings people together in interesting ways, but it also can be polarizing and manipulated. So I'm just wondering if our panelists have thoughts on social media and that impact on news, how we are better consumers of social media, and maybe if you're willing to talk about how you see things evolving social media. Where is that going? How do we make it better? You foresee regulations coming to impact that? So big, broad topic. That alone is another hour of conversation. But again, I'll open it up starting with Talia to share some thoughts on that, and then go to Tom.
Yeah, perfect. Happy to, and agree. I could spend eons doing this. I had a direct message in the chat and just want to clarify that my thoughts in terms of labeling are that news organizations and social media, for that matter, should be responsible for doing some of this labeling, because the effort that it involves for the consumer is just massive to ask everyone to determine true versus false or news versus opinion. So just wanted to be clear about that. So social media is a fascinating topic. Even in my 15 years of being a professor at the University of Texas, I've seen the shift in my students to where now by far the majority are getting their news from social media. And a significant chunk of them will say things like, if it's important, it'll find me on social media. So they're not even actively pursuing news. They're relying on it to hit them from their social networks, which has some disturbing consequences, because there's certainly some information that's more likely to hit social media and blow up, and other sorts of information that's just not amenable to the algorithms that prioritize the content that we see. So I think I'll try to parse through your question in a couple of different ways. The first being just a broad brush, like what are some of the effects of social media? There's been a lot of research on this, as you might imagine, and I'm actually involved right now in a major initiative to understand the effects of Facebook and Instagram on the 2020 election, and the results of that will probably be out at the end of this year or early next year. But we're actually working with with Facebook to do this work, which is complicated in a number of different ways, but I think that'll be really important to understand its effect. But what we know right now is that, of course, misinformation is traveling on these platforms. They've made some efforts to curb misinformation, but by no means are they able to totally get rid of it. And I don't think that that's a possibility for the foreseeable future. It's simply a cat and a mouse game. As soon as one player moves, almost chess, right? The next one reacts, trying to figure out a way to share misinformation for those who have bad intentions. We also know that it can increase polarization. There have been studies where they're looking at what happens if you remove Facebook. So if you take people and say, okay, half of you get off of Facebook for a time period, the other half go ahead and go about your business, and then they survey them afterward. And what they find is the people who were removed from Facebook are a bit less polarized, but they're also a bit less knowledgeable, which I think is important to be clear about, because you do learn things on social media, and it's not a net bad all the time. We did a survey where we asked people in 20 different countries to tell us what they like about social media and what they don't like. And overwhelmingly, people have positive evaluations. They've connected with people across distances. They've found long lost friends. They're able to keep up with family. And so there are really important positives to social media. I think second part of your question was to do with regulation. I think that regulation is coming down the pipeline. I think essentially the social media companies have almost been asking for it, because I think they're having a hard time figuring out what to do in particular cases. I've been really fascinated. If you haven't been following the Facebook Oversight Board, I so encourage you to do so. Essentially what Facebook has been doing is, for all intents and purposes, setting up its own legal system where people can appeal if they've had content removed, or if they've been blocked, or if some negative action has been taken against them. And Facebook has set up a trust and a group of people who are now adjudicating these cases, and they're literally figuring out their recommendation. And Facebook has agreed that their recommendations are binding, and they're including this information online in very readable, like 1 to 2 pages. Here's what we ruled and why. So that's, I think, one to watch. And to me, that's the most fascinating. It's not regulation per se, but it's a type of self-regulation that I don't think we've totally seen before, of setting up your own legal system. So I am eager to keep following that one really closely. And then I think the third part, Mike, of your question, if I've got all of them, was thinking about what we can do when we're on social media. And one of the biggest recommendations I would make is really look at the source of the information that you're seeing there. And I don't mean like which of your friends might have shared it. I mean, literally, where did it come from? They did a study recently where they had people, people had agreed to allow them to track what they were doing online. And within 10 to 48 hours after people had seen the news, they were asking them, what news site did you go to? And it was less than half of the people who had gone to news from social media that could remember at all what the brand was. So there's something about social media that's making people just click on things without being very thoughtful or mindful about what the source is. And there are so many ways to find out if a source is reliable. If you see something there that you're like, I've never heard of that source before, do a quick Google search to find out, is that source reliable or not? Facebook has instituted a little I button next to some of the sources that you can click on that provide some information about them. But I think the biggest thing is just really think through, is this a reliable source that's being shared here? And should I share that again? Or is this something that I'm not quite sure about, in which case use caution in clicking on it, use caution in sharing it. So that attentiveness to the source would be my biggest recommendation for navigating news on social.
You sounded excited about this Facebook Oversight Board. Are you optimistic that this is a good solution, that it's going to work?
It's a really tricky territory, right? Because you've got to think through what the alternatives are. The alternative would be that Facebook itself, or social media companies in general, this doesn't have to be Facebook, gets to make the decision, and that there's no oversight whatsoever, which they could do in our current system. I don't like that. I don't think that that should be the way things are. Alternatively, you could see government come in and set up some system, and that could be tricky potentially, right? Depending on who is in government and your own political leanings, and could change dramatically over time. And it's why we have some of the protections that we have in place in the United States. In my mind, this is at least an interesting third option. I would be skeptical that they got it right the first time, and we all think that this is the best way to move forward. I think we might want to think through, who should be on this board, how are they selected, all those sorts of questions. But they did try to be quite thoughtful about it. And so I am actually curious to follow how it goes. I think so far it's been interesting. They've been asked to take up Trump's deplatforming, and that decision should be out sometime soon. And I think that will be a pivotal moment for whether this is an effective solution.
Interesting. So let's turn to Tom. Thoughts on social media?
Well, this is a very challenging topic. You had posed the question earlier, perhaps Joanne had, of what were the benefits and the downsides to social media. So let me begin by flipping through a few of those quickly. Speed is a benefit. News can be distributed virtually real time from wherever it's happening. Social media is apparently free if one doesn't include the effects of the collection of your personal data and the aggressive advertising. And it has achieved remarkable ways for friends and relatives to stay in touch, which was sort of the original idea of it. And it has changed dramatically since it first came into being. Downsides, it's led to creative and aggressive collection of people's personal data to further the financial success of social media companies. And this is something that we discovered that most people haven't realized, in that the media industry, for the most part, lived off of advertising. That was its financial base. Now, digital media receive 55% of all the advertising, and that happens to be $239 billion a year in 2019 in the country. And now social media and other digital sources receive 55%, and print media receives 6%. So you can understand why newspapers are failing and why they cannot continue to hire quality reporters and do investigations and do verification and so forth. So that is a downside. Although the industry is referred to as social media, it really isn't a media. In fact, I've seen in a video, I believe it was in the Social Dilemma, executives from social media companies denying that they were media companies. They don't want to be media companies. That has something to do with Section 230. They don't create any news. They don't have any reporters. They just transmit what other people or other organizations post. Now, that's not to say that you can't find postings from Associated Press or Axios or something else on social media. And if you chose to get all your news from quality sources, that would be great. But I suspect that most people don't, and most people don't even know where it comes from. Speed tempts the reporter of news to print what he or she just saw or believes, often without taking any time for verification. And that's a big part of the problem. People see something, they hear something, they just post it, they pass it along, it goes viral, and it's wrong. It can and is used by bad guys like terrorists, like the people who invaded the Capitol on January the 6th. And there's plenty of evidence about the communication that they did vis-a-vis social media. via social media. Unfortunately, that's the FBI is also privy to all of that information, and apparently is arresting those people by the hundreds. Some people feel that, and this is what got my initial prejudice up against social media, feel that youngsters are missing a lot of real social interaction by having their faces buried in their cell phones much of every day. We take our grandchildren out to eat, and we can't get their hands off their cell phones, and they don't talk to us. We feel like we hardly know our grandchildren. We have one who's autistic, and we know him better than we do the others. He was over here just an hour or two ago. Anyhow, as far as regulation is concerned, this is an interesting topic because the Connecticut Alliance of Braver Angels, and Doug Teschner is on this program with us, and he is a regional representative of the Northeast of the United States. Just a week ago, had a debate, and it happened to be their very first event, Zoom event, by a brand new alliance. And they had a debate, and the resolution of the debate is social media should be regulated. And they did a wonderful job on that. And I got the impression that none of them really felt like it should be regulated, particularly if it were going to have a chance of stepping on the First Amendment. Anyhow, the regulation is a very sensitive subject, particularly if it's done by the government, but expecting social media companies to censor themselves the billions of transmissions that happen every day seems pretty unrealistic to me. There's got to be some other solution. Anyhow, thanks for the question. Social media is a very important topic, and it is far from fixed.
Right, that's a long discussion. I remember a group of experts commenting half jokingly, but only half jokingly, they were almost at the verge of being able to get rid of election campaigns because Facebook can quite accurately predict how you're going to vote, often a few months before you make your decision. So just let them take care of it. Anyway, Joanne, do we still want to show one more film clip?
Yeah, I would. Let's try the last one that has to do with bias in reporting, and it will, I think, generate lots of conversation. So let's watch.
If you're an editor and you're sending somebody to cover a fire, right? A fire, to me, the reason that I use the fire example is that it's the most sort of kind of mundane. You don't, if you're a reader, you're not thinking that there are 27 different loaded political implications of a fire. It's not, initially you're not thinking it's a race issue or a gender issue, or it's not like you're doing a story on abortion or police abuse. It's just a local arson, right? But if you send 7 different people to cover that fire, you can come back with 7 different stories because there's no one objective truth, right?
Yeah,
one reporter goes to the fire and they will bring back a story that's very human interest. The lead will be about, the little kid sitting on the side of the road with the charred teddy bear that was burned up in the fire, and the tears are running down the face, and where's the family going to live? And then you get into the fire from that family's story. Somebody else who's much more interested in local infrastructure might do a story based on how the city council recently slashed the fire department budget, and so it took the 2 towns over, the fire department came and instead of the local fire department that was closed, and that's the implications of the budget issues. There's so many different ways to approach even a mundane non-political story, right? Or not that many things are
precisely, and
right?
It's a really putting a actual solid point about how different it can be,
right?
Exactly. Yeah,
and
exactly.
So then if we think about objectivity as if we problematize the one of the absolute mainstays of corporate journalism in America. I can't speak to journalism outside America, but one of the absolute mainstays of journalism here is that is this myth of objectivity, this idea, well, what is just called objectivity, that I call the myth of objectivity, and that some other folks like Bob McChesney and others have called the myth of objectivity for years, which is that, the idea that you can't have an opinion, that there is one sort of truth, and you have to find that truth, and that underneath this idea of objectivity is journalists can separate themselves completely from any social issue. They can separate themselves completely from any opinion. Some newsrooms used to not even allow or discourage journalists from voting. Many newsrooms still have policies where journalists are not allowed in their personal time to donate to particular candidates or nonprofits or go to rallies or et cetera. The idea that journalists have to be some sort of robotic people without any kind of opinions, any kind of feelings, it actually cannot happen. I believe that myth of objectivity actually ends up creating the opposite effect in news, because when you are not thinking about your own implicit biases, when you're not thinking about your own opinions, when you're not thinking about the slants that you bring personally to a story based on your gender, your race, your geographic region, your age, your work history, your family history, your history with or no history with law enforcement, whatever your particular identity, your health, your ability or disability, whatever your life circumstances are, everything has brought you to this one particular story. If you ignore that you have those ideas, then you're not thinking about going the extra mile to find sources who don't necessarily agree with you.
Wow, so bias and covering even a fire story. Let's have Talia comment on that first, then Tom. And then I'd like to open this up to questions from the audience, because discussion is just running longer than we had expected because it's such a good topic. So the questions of bias that they raised, Talia, any thoughts or comments there?
The one thing I would share about media bias that I think is really interesting is they've done these studies, and if you find an article or a broadcast that perhaps we could find something that hews down the middle, like it maybe is something that we might think of as unbiased. Grant me that for a second. They find that if you have something like that people on the left think it's biased in favor of people on the right, and people on the right think it's biased in favor of people on the left. And this has been shown in academic research over and over and over again, that the best day for someone that's trying to hew in the middle is everyone hates it. And that's, I think, really the crux of the problem here. It's like a psychological issue among humans. We are not good at detecting biases in our favor, and we are very good at detecting biases against us. And when we have that sort of psychological predisposition, that's what leads us to media that tilt a little one direction or another, because then it seems totally unbiased to us, because we can't shake ourselves out of our own partisan ways of looking at the world. And so I think that this question of bias, it applies to journalists, it applies to people, we're all humans. And it just makes it so clear why it's such a tricky place to be, to talk about objectivity and to think about lack of bias, because it happens for all of us.
Interesting. Tom, any thoughts here?
Well, many people, and this has happened to us in our meetings, think that every article in the media is biased, that everything is biased. But I take the stand that even if you were to agree that's true, there are some things that are much more biased than others, and we all know that. We know that certain TV programs or certain publications have a great amount of bias in them. I don't agree that the person writing the story or giving the story necessarily should be allowed to have his or her race, gender, or any other of 100 biases creep into the story. If you have real journalism, their objective should be to give an unbiased presentation of the news. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be boring. And that doesn't mean that an investigative reporter who admits what he's doing might choose to talk about the fire department and the political fight between the two fire departments and so forth. And that can be a useful article, but it needs to be admitted in the text of where the person is coming from that's writing this article. Anyhow, I think the whole issue is complicated by the fact that there is so much polarization in this country, both in the media and in the public. And if you talk about the public, you have to include the politicians. And so everyone is looking for it, and everyone is taking a stand that whatever somebody else says must be wrong. So we have to get back to this common ground issue, which is part of the basis of thinking for both Braver Angels and Common Ground for Texans, that we have to reduce the level of angst in our country. And our organizations can help do that. It's not an easy task. But the average citizen, I think, is pretty fed up with it. And if we've got a groundswell going of reducing polarization, that could happen. And in some of our meetings, we've asked people, well, is the fault the people and the politicians, or is the fault the media, which caused the polarization? And universally, there was agreement that they feed off of each other. And it takes two, as my mother used to tell us kids, takes two to make a fight. She wouldn't choose sides. She would say we were both wrong and we both got in trouble. Anyhow, that's my thought on bias. It's rampant in our country, and it's certainly dividing our country excessively.
I think most people on this video would agree with you strongly and would agree with your hopes and dreams there. So, Ham, let's queue up some questions here. There's a lot of things I could ask and keep the conversation going, but we want to be able to get some of the audience questions on here too. Let me turn over to you.
Well, the audience has not been doing a very good job of submitting questions. Urge you all to get to it. We do have a couple. Tobin Quero has at least a comment, soliciting comments from the panelists, I'm sure. He says, one issue that this raises is the power and persistence of confirmation bias. It is an issue that is intensified by social media and the range of options for information choices. Challenging one's own beliefs is a challenging task indeed.
Anyone care to comment from our panel? Other than nod your heads?
Yeah, I think point very well taken. I think it's interesting to see how that happens in the social media era. And it happens due to two things that then work together to make it worse. One is our own confirmation biases as we're gravitating toward information. But then that's compounded in social media because what you click on, what you comment on, that actually feeds into the algorithm that then determines what to show you more of. And so it then creates this cycle where you're seeing more and more information that might agree with your beliefs. And then it leads you to consume more of that. And it creates a bit of a circle. And social media companies have, even in the past week or so, one of the VPs of Facebook wrote a Medium post saying, yeah, maybe there's some part of it that's us, but it's also people that are feeding the algorithm. And it's an interesting thing to think about, where is the responsibility? Where should it lie? Should it lie with the people? Well, maybe a little bit, but certainly some of it should also rely with these platforms that they create the algorithms. They decide what sort of interaction or engagement prioritizes information. So just a little riff on that comment.
Cynthia Lesky has a question. Is the media bias chart from then the URL adfontesmedia.com, is that a reliable guide to the degree of bias in the sources it rates?
What was the name of the organization again?
It's adfontesmedia.com.
I'll take that one. It's adfontesmedia.com or .org.
Okay.
ADFONTES media. So you can Google it and you can find that.
It's in the chat.
Okay. I don't know a lot about it, but I've plowed through their website. They have several pages on their methodology for doing things. So that's a good starting place, is to go to Ad Fontes and read what they have to say about how they come to their decisions. They're the only ones I've found that have a two-way chart. On the abscissa, they have whether it leans left or right, and that's what All Sides does. And so they have 5 columns, and they show you the center and leaning left and leaning right and so on. But on the ordinate, Ad Fontes also rates the reliability or the accuracy of the effort. And the chart's a little hard to read because it's crowded. But if you join them, and I checked today, and it costs about $10 a month to actually join and get all the information, but you can get most of it for free. But if you join, you can, instead of looking at that chart, which is pretty crowded and hard to read, you can put a particular organization in, like Texas Tribune or Houston Chronicle or Chicago Tribune or whatever, or MSNBC, and find out what they say about it. And one way to judge whether you think it does a good job or not is just to take the ones that it claims does a good job and look at a few of them and see if you agree with that. Anyhow, it's a good start, I think. And let me say while I'm on this topic, that there are a number of new sources these days for media, and many of them are aggregators of other media. So there's Axios, and of course there's Associated Press, and there's the Flip Side, and at least 6 or 8 others that are better than watching the Huffington Post, reading the Huffington Post, or watching the Fox News or MSNBC and so forth. So anybody that has any reservation about whether he or she's being told the truth should start digging, and fairly quickly will come to the conclusion that, well, why don't I just make some changes? I'm talking too much, but let me say one more thing. I have changed how much time I spend on certain kinds of media over the last 6 or 8 months since I've been doing this. I realized that I was partaking in what's called infotainment, where Fox News or some other organization is telling you what you want to hear because they can make more money doing that, and they can financially survive than they can by presenting objective news. And that's a serious problem. And part of the blame for that lies at the feet of social media.
Well, congratulations. A success story. I'm glad you did that. And what did you use as a guide to broaden your views to this particular website?
What news sources do I use?
Yeah.
Well,
So I put a couple of them in the chat that might help.
let me rattle off some. There's all sides, defactual. Somebody can type these into the chat if they want. Axios, Associated Press, Texas Tribune, and I came across, thanks to my wife, PBS, which I really wasn't aware of how good that seems to be, and I only watched it an hour or so, but I suspect that it may be one of the most objective TV channels out there. The New Paper, the Dispatch, and the Flip Side. And I get most of these by email daily, and I try to scan through them. And most of them are aggregators. They present some news developed by others. Anyhow, I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks. Talia, any other thoughts on that?
Would just add that I've seen this many times before, and I agree. I think it's at least a good start, right? It's excessively difficult to determine what's biased and what isn't in a reliable way. And at least they have a method. They're very clear about it. They have people from diverse political viewpoints examining articles. So I think I agree with Tom that this is at least a good start.
So another question comes from Henry Harris, who asks, has this group addressed the subject of misinformation as a weapon being used by non-American adversaries?
Who wants to take that one first?
I'll say I don't know that we address it specifically, but misinformation and disinformation are a little different, and they are both manifestations of something other than the truth, either the bias or being untruthful, which are different manifestations of bad news. Sometimes I just have to use the term bad or poor because it covers the waterfront.
Yeah, there have been a couple of folks at the Center for Media Engagement that have done some research looking at how this is happening and tracking down what sort of groups and what sort of techniques and how possible is it to identify. It's getting more challenging as time goes on. So if you look back at 2016 and some of the Internet Research Agency sorts of posts, in hindsight, they're a lot easier to detect because there are use of exclamation marks, the kind of stereotypes that they're employing, the grammar that's being used. They've gotten much better over time. And a great place to also look for this information is Facebook is quite public about its takedowns on its site. And so when they're taking down accounts, they're typically who knows if they're announcing all of them, but they're certainly announcing it on their site and giving justifications. So for instance, a takedown that they did in March were international groups that were really trying to target Black communities in the United States and giving them poor information. But it's not only misinformation, it's also trying to just inflame passions of different groups and sow discord within the country. And so I think when we think about these groups, keeping that in mind, that it's not always disinformation, there's also these attitudinal components, I think is worth keeping in mind when you're looking at what's happening online. And then a number of the social media companies have been trying over time to say, you have to be in the United States, for example, to advertise on the platforms. And they've been trying to clamp down on this a bit, but I think this will be an ongoing challenge in our information environment. And yeah, the distinction between mis and disinformation, there are a number of groups that define those differently. The definition that I find for me most compelling is that disinformation involves the intention to leave people with incorrect information, whereas misinformation also involves incorrect messages, but could be from people that don't intend to do so. So if you share something because you thought it was truthful, but it turns out it wasn't truthful, there are some people that would then call that misinformation. And the more intentional kind disinformation. But as Tom clearly notes, there are different definitions for these all over the place, which is unfortunate. And I've been to so many conferences about this, and inevitably it turns to, yes, but how do we define this? Which it turns out to be quite tricky.
Another question comes from Joanne McKenzie, who is on the Common Ground board. She asks whether you are aware of any efforts to teach elementary, middle school, and high school kids how to be better consumers of the news.
There are a number of just fantastic media literacy initiatives that are taking place. I'll Google a couple of them as Tom responds and include them in the chat. But there are some fantastic initiatives that are working on that. And then even at the University of Texas, we have an effort within the Moody College of Communication to help undergraduate students better understand what it means to be media literate in today's world. Everything from how do you know that a website is safe, to how could you identify the source of information, to what are some of the techniques of those that are looking to give people problematic information. So there's a huge effort here, and I think it's an important skill, just like reading, just like math nowadays, for kids to learn.
Tom.
I know that this is one of Joanne's pet topics. You've probably heard it, Ham, but we do need more education in the schools of young children in civics and reading and other matters like this. And I don't have any young children. Mine are both in their 50s. And but I do understand that science and mathematics and so forth have taken over some of the time that's spent, at least this is what I hear, used to be spent on history and some of the more cultural subjects. It is important for young children to understand their social responsibilities and to be trained to think carefully about what they're taught and so forth. So, but as Joanne will tell you, it's all in the minds of the beholder, and what Rhode Island might think is the right thing to teach its children, and what Alabama or Texas or some other state might think is the right thing is can be quite different. But it's better, in my opinion, if we have the states making those decisions, because they are cradles of democracy. And if we have one organization, mainly the U.S. Congress, making decisions like that, the chances are just as good that it'll all be wrong as that it'll all be right. So my prejudices are showing through.
As we said, everybody has their bias.
Tobin Crow interjects a humorous question. Which came first, the chicken or the algorithm?
The chicken or the algorithm?
John and Susan Teese ask, could you address the generational differences in using media and how that affects our ability to communicate between generations about news, facts, opinions, etc.?
Well, I'll say very quickly that research has showed that different ages of people use different kinds of media. People my age are much more likely to read print media, and younger people rely much more heavily on social media. And that's just the way it is. And we have a grandson who's a college student, and he gets all his news off the media. He says he will just grab his cell phone 10 or 20 times a day and grab one or two little bites of media off of it. And he is a very intelligent person, a junior at Rice University. And that's how he gets his news. I hope he's intelligent enough to pay some attention to which ones he's following. Let me read this right quick. here's what we would like to do at Media Action Group is to convey to huge numbers of people. If you are consuming inaccurate or biased news, you are hurting yourself and your country. Please consider switching to much better sources, something that is easy and rewarding to do. So in terms of explanation, let me say that I think it's very difficult to teach people, if it's possible, how to watch or read a particular news item and then decide whether it's truthful or whether it's biased. It's just extremely difficult. I think it's got to be a lot easier to plant the seeds of discontent in their minds. So they'll say, well, you know, I think I might be getting gypped. And there are hundreds or thousands of media sources out there, and it won't hurt me to change. And let me mention to one of our Braver Angels leader here in Central Texas, Mike C. He's a person who leans blue, but he's a very intelligent person, a lawyer and a CPA. And he just decided, and I'll have to say to some extent after attending some of our meetings, although he's plenty capable of doing it without hearing it from us, that perhaps he ought to try something different. So he gave up all the media sources that he'd been following and switched to the other side, switched to leaning red. And then he wrote us a one-page letter about that, the effect it had on him. And he learned a tremendous amount by doing that. So people can change and they can get a lot out of it.
One thing that I'll share is in one of my undergraduate classes, one of the assignments throughout the semester is that students have to go to, and I have a list of different news sources, and they have to spend a week with each of these different sources. And they are the full range of medium, of political perspective. It's all over the map. And I get so much feedback from students about that activity because their minds are blown in a sense at the end, like, oh, wow, now I kind of can get why there are so many differences and why people are feeling so differently and how this is different. And it's one of my favorite assignments. And I wish we would all do it together and chat about it. Wouldn't it be such an amazing experiment to say, okay, this next week, we are all going to watch Fox News and that's all we're going to watch. And then we're going to talk about it. And then the week after MSNBC. And then the week after that, we're just going to go to Twitter. That's it, the whole week. And just feel what that is to be a very different news consumer that crosses generations and that crosses political persuasions. It's a wonderful activity. And I love so much doing it with my students.
So if I might say, Braver Angels might actually consider doing something like that. We have a group that meets every other week that is reading the Constitution. And we talk about what the Constitution means and how we interpret it today and what it meant then. And none of us are particularly scholars in this area, but it's been absolutely fascinating going back to read the original wording. But it could be a lot of fun to do something like that on a every other week basis of saying, okay, let's all read this particular source and see what we do.
This is actually a wonderful note to wrap this up on. People are starting to drift away. I'm watching the participant count. The idea of watching Fox News for a week seems rather daunting, but now I'm intrigued. As just an experiment to satisfy my curiosity. I want to thank our two panelists very much. This was a wonderful talk. There's a lot of great information in the chat, including a bunch of questions we didn't even get to yet. But there's always more time for discussion in subsequent meetings. Joanne, is there anything else you want to say to wrap this up?
No, I'd just like to thank the two speakers who were absolutely fabulous today. It was just really wonderful. And my eyes have been opened as I have been reading sources that are new to me now. And I have a favorite cartoon that I look at from time to time to try to remember. And it's two people looking at the same object, but on one side, they're looking at some lines and they say there are 3 columns, and the other person is looking from the same diagram and says, no, there are 4. And you know what? They're both right. Because of the perspective in which and the way the optical illusion, right, is drawn. And so that's sort of opened up my eyes to say, okay, here is a bucket of facts, and here's one set of eyes looking at that bucket of facts, and here's another set of eyes looking at that bucket of facts, and they're telling a different story, but they're all telling the story from the same bucket of facts, and they're equally reliable, and so that has been an eye opener for me. And so again, I would like to thank everyone and to encourage everybody who's been on the call to expand your reading, just to see what's out there, because there's a lot out there that's really quite interesting from a perspective that may be other than your own perspective, but is well worth reading nonetheless. And again, thank you both very much. As usual, we will put this videotape up on the web, so that if you have friends that you want to impress and you want to tell them to come look at this video, go ahead and do it. We do have lots of folks who have other opportunities on Saturday and can't make it. So again, thank you all very much, and maybe we'll see you on May 15th to see what happened with the May election.
Thank you so much, everyone. Joanne, Mike, Ham, and Tom. Such a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Joanne, Mike, and Ham.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dick, are you going to capture the chat?
Yep.
Okay. There's some good links.
Yeah, good resources we have.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which is what I was hoping for. Yeah, and I've tried to copy a couple of them myself because I'm curious. Well, thanks, Mike. It worked out really well.
Yep.
And Talia had an hour and a half, and we did an hour and a half. So there we are. Yeah, I think it was well worth it. There were 34 folks. That's a good number.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and Ham, you did a good job switching back and forth with the videos.
Yeah, excellent.
That was kind of flawless.
It went very well. And Mike, I hope that you thought that they generated some conversation as well. So.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I thought they did.
Yep.
Just an independent look at things.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
2 very different perspectives and experience levels.
Yeah. And to hear from journalists is rather than from an academician and somebody who's new to this whole issue, I thought would be fascinating.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.